QuickBooks Pro Desktop 2021. Company preferences, search, send forms, service connection, spelling, tax, 1099, and time and expenses. Let's get into it with Intuit's QuickBooks Pro Desktop 2021. Here we are in the Get Great Guitars Company homepage. We're going to go to the Edit dropdown. We're going to go down to the Preferences. Edit dropdown and then the Preferences. In prior presentations, we've been working from accounting on down to the sales tax. We're going to try to round this thing out now, finishing it up, doing the final preference items down below. Starting with the search field, we're going to keep the My Preferences as is. We're going to go to the Company Preferences. QuickBooks Desktop updates search information frequently, so changes to company file can appear in search result. Select how often to update search information. So search box preferences update automatically. That's going to be the preference. That's typically what I will use unless you, for whatever reason, don't want it to be updating, possibly not connecting to the internet all the time. If you want to manually try to update the search options, you can do so. So update every 60 minutes. Again, if you want to extend that, if you would rather not, if it's going to interfere with some other process perhaps, then maybe you want to make that a different time frame to make the updates. So update now. So if you want to turn this off and then simply update when you choose to update, then you can go in here and do the updates whenever you feel to do them instead of having them automatically being done. So then we have the send forms. So we're going to go into these send forms. My preferences on the send forms. We have the auto check the email letter checkbox if customer's preferred delivery method is email. So we're going to keep that as the default. More and more, of course, the delivery method is going towards email, and probably that's a good thing. Obviously, on the side of people that are going to be sending out the information, it'll typically be easier, faster to do. Use plain text form for email invoicing. So I'm going to keep the default there. Send email using either webmail or Outlook or QuickBooks email. Now this is going to be relevant if you're going to be sending this information directly out of QuickBooks itself, meaning you could take something like the message and then download it, or whatever you're emailing, you can download it or save it as a PDF file and then attach it in whatever web server, whatever web email you are using, either a web email or Outlook. However, if you want to send it directly out of QuickBooks and reduce that step in the process, then you're going to have to basically connect your email to QuickBooks. We may discuss this in the future, but you'd have to connect your email to QuickBooks. Now, if you have something like a Gmail account or something like that as your primary account, that's going to be a web-based email, so you'd have to be dealing with that. If you're using Outlook, then Outlook is something that is a Microsoft Outlook that you would have to then connect. You connect Outlook to whatever email you would be using. So, for example, you might be using Gmail and Outlook, and then your Outlook is running through the Gmail. The Gmail is running through the Microsoft Outlook program. So then you'd want to be connecting Outlook to your QuickBooks, or you can have a QuickBooks email, check for valid subscriptions and set up the QuickBooks email. And that would probably be the easiest thing to do, because then you're not going to be linking anything. But the QuickBooks email is probably not most people's primary email service. They probably have some preferred email service. If you're working in a company, they may very likely have Outlook. If you're working as a sole proprietor, you quite likely have a web-based email such as a Gmail account. Okay, so then we're going to go to the company. I'm going to keep that as the default as we go here. We might talk about that in more depth in the future, but we're basically going to keep that as a default. Okay, so delivery method default, we can have email, mail, or none. I'm going to keep it as email as the delivery method being the default. So when we send things out, such as the invoices, then we're going to say, let's keep it as the email. Obviously, if you're going to be sending by mail, then you can change the default to mail. So email templates, we have the invoices, estimates, and so on. And we can take a look at the templates on down below. So we have the basic invoice. That's the only template that we have thus far. We can set up more email templates. We're going to be using the default or basic templates here. And again, we might have more of a specialty section after we go through the basics of basically the accounting process to think about customizing the templates. Now the customization of the templates is fairly straightforward for a lot of the process. You can put a logo on your invoice and this kind of thing. which is really nice here. So, but when we go through the practice problem, we're going to be focusing mainly on, the logistics of creating the invoice and what the impact on the financials will be. And then maybe we'll go into more detail in terms of the customization process of the templates so that you get the look and feel of them with your customers at a future point. So that's going to be that. And then we're going to go to the service connections. So let's go to the My Preferences. Give me the option of saving a file when I download Web Connect data. I'm going to keep that as the default. If QuickBooks is run by my browser, don't close it after Web Connect is done. I'm going to keep those as the default settings for the service connections. And again, unless you don't want to be connected to the internet for whatever reason, possibly because you want to save bandwidth or something like that, I would keep the defaults. How do you want to handle your connection to QuickBooks services? The following settings apply to all QuickBooks services except payroll and bank feeds. Automatically connect without asking for the password. So, and that's again the default if you want that automatic process. This doesn't apply to the bank feeds, and we'll talk more about the bank feeds once again in a separate section after we go through these items here. The bank feeds are something that you want to have some understanding of the general process before you get into the bank feeds, and then we'll talk about how you connect to the bank and download those items. But that's a little bit different than most of the other kind of things. Always ask for a password before connecting, so you can have that item. Allow background downloading of service messages. So it's going to be downloading in the background. So typically you would want that unless, again, it would be interfering possibly with other type of processes. If you have bandwidth limitations, then maybe you want to turn that off and only be doing the connections when you tell it to. And then we have the spelling. So spelling, always check spelling before printing, saving, or sending supporting forms. That's always good for me. So I'll keep that on. Ignore words with internet address. So if it's always picking up something like an address or something like that, you can click this off and say, hey, don't pick up, the web address. I'm going to keep the defaults here. Numbers, if it has a number in it, they have the default. So if it has a number in it, don't tell me it's misspelled. So capitalize first letter. So you could say if the word itself has a capital in the first letter, then it might be a name, or it could quite likely be a name, therefore don't check it. So I don't typically do that because I'd rather check it, and then, I'll just say don't here. I'd rather not do that. So all uppercase letters. So if it has something like an ASAP, then it's quite likely an abbreviation and not a word. So unless you type in capital letters, then if you check this off, it's less likely to give you a spell check for items with capital letters. Mixed case, something like QuickBooks, it has a capital letter in the middle of the word, is quite likely something that's not normally spelled, but something that's not wrong. And then you have, these are your custom added words. So remove any that you don't want by clicking the check mark in the delete. So what you can do is add basically, or delete custom words down below. And these are going to be words that, they won't pick up in a spell check. So even though they might be misspelled like government or abbreviation, you might still not, it won't check it as misspelled, which is nice. So you can remove any of these by clicking it here and then hitting the delete item up top. All right, then let's go to the company preferences. Company preferences, nothing here. So now we're going to go on down to the 1099. So tax 1099, let's start at the My Preferences, nothing in My Preferences. Company preferences, do you file 1099 miscellaneous forms? Now the default is going to be yes. Now the 1099 miscellaneous forms, if you're a company and you pay money to somebody else, basically in the US, United States, the IRS is trying more and more to be able to detect whether someone has income or not, to try to get them to know that they need to file their taxes, so they can kind of check on their taxes to make sure that they're filing. And they have the most pressure on the person that is paying the other person's income. So in other words, every time we pay somebody else as a business, whoever we are paying, that is income to them. It's an expense to us, it's income to them. The IRS would like to basically get some verification that whoever we paid got money, so that they can basically check and make sure that they are reporting their taxes and the IRS is getting their share of it. So therefore, the IRS is going to try to pressure, if we want the deduction, for us to issue a 1099 both to the person that we sent the money to and to the IRS, so the IRS knows that they need to be taxing this individual, or knows that this individual or needs to be reporting on their taxes. The IRS does not really charge, so the general rule is if they are a business, like a corporation, if they're set up as a corporation, then you typically do not need to be 1099ing them, because the IRS has sufficient pressure to be able to check on them and make sure they're reporting their taxes already. But if you're talking about a contractor, then the IRS is going to say if they're not incorporated and they're a contractor and you pay them over a pretty small amount of money, then you're going to want to 1099 those individuals, or the IRS is requiring you to 1099 them. So most companies will have some contractors and therefore will need to 1099 them. So the three ways that you could pay somebody, or the three kind of buckets you can think of, is, are you paying a corporation? Then they're not related to you, but they're a corporation, so you don't need to 1099 them typically. Are you paying an employee? If you're paying an employee, you're issuing them a W-2, therefore you don't need to 1099 them. You're going to be reporting to the IRS that they have earned money with a W-2, not a 1099. If you are paying a contractor and you're over a fairly small threshold of money, then you typically need to be 1099. You need to track that information. So most companies will have a yes here, and then you would be tracking the vendors that you're paying. So if you want a map, your account on the boxes, Form 1099 miscellaneous. I won't go into more detail at this point now. If you're ready to prepare your 1099s, including MAPI accounts, you can click here. So you can take a look at these items for more detail for the 1099s. Tax, time, and expenses. So let's go to the My Preferences here. Nothing in My Preferences for time and expenses. So this is time tracking. So this time tracking can be used to help with the recording of employee wages if you're recording by the hour. It can also be helpful for your recording of invoices. So even if you're a sole proprietor and you're the only person working, you might track your time and then set a billable rate so that that time can then be picked up when you create your invoices. One way to kind of record your invoices. So do you track time? If we say we're going to keep the default as yes, and then first day of work week is we're going to say is Monday. So that's fine. You can change the date if the first day is Sunday, for example. Mark all time entries as billable. So when you enter time into the system, you're just going to track your time. It's just like a clocking in and out. You're going to track your time. If you choose to use this, many people don't. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it. But if you choose to use it, you can track your time. And you can use that tracking time to, once again, track employee time so that you can pay them. But that's not the only function. You can also use it to track your own time. And then once you create an invoice, you can cause that time to be billed on the invoice. You can set a rate for the time for whoever's working, yourself and or others. And then you could set a rate for it, and then the invoice will be generated automatically based on the hours that have been worked. To do that, when you enter the time, you have to set the time as billable, meaning you're going to bill it, meaning when you create an invoice, the invoice is kind of our bill that we're going to send to the customers. It will then populate the billable time on it. So then we have the invoice option, track reimbursed expenses as income. So in other words, when you create a bill, if you enter a bill into the QuickBooks system and you pay for something like let's say gas or something like that, and then you invoice the client for it, you make that item billable when you pay for it, and then when you make the invoice to the client, it'll be billable. Now, if you don't check this off, it'll kind of net it out as the expense. The expense will net out, and so you'll have a net expense, right? So it was a reimbursed expense. Oftentimes for taxes, it makes more sense. The IRS actually oftentimes wants to see it in the format of you charge the client revenue. So in that case, in other words, if I charged the gas expense, if I had to pay $100 of gas, and then I charged the client for it, rather than having income of $100 of income and then an expense of $100 of gas that would net out in net income, if you don't check this, it'll just net out and the expense will not be there. It won't be included in income and it won't be included in the expense. I'm actually going to check this off because oftentimes many companies want to see that, right? If you make your invoice based on some of the expenses that you had recorded, then oftentimes you're going to be wanting to see the income that you have received, even though it's a reimbursement, meaning show it in income and then show the expense related to it. So include the $100 of the money that you got in the invoice in income, and then show the expense that you paid the result on net income, netting it out, but it's included in the gross income that you'd receive. So I'm going to click that here. Mark all expenses as billable. So when you go to the expenses or entering the expenses, do you want to mark them as billable? Meaning, are they going to be something that will then show up on the invoice? So I'm going to keep the default for this as checked off here, and we'll see that we'll demonstrate this function when we go to the enter some of the expenses. Remember, most of the expenses, a lot of times for many companies, your expenses are not billable. You won't charge them to the customer. Meaning, if you pay like the phone company and the utility company, you don't include then those payments oftentimes on the bill to the customer. But if you're in some industries, you're going to be charging things like gas or something like that, or certain just forms that you might need, or costs, or construction that you might be buying things that you're going to use in a job or something like that, and those things would then oftentimes be included in an invoice. That's one way you could start to construct your invoice, and so that would be making them billable. So I'll keep the default here. Default markup percent. If something is billable, if you have this checked as billable, and then you want to say, okay, for the gas that I spent, if I spent $100 in gas, I want to not only bill the gas, but I want to bill my markup. So if there's a 30% markup, it's going to bill the gas plus the 30% markup, because that's the revenue that we're generating. That's one way you can create your cost structure. So I'm going to keep it as nothing here, but you could change that. And then the default markup account, if you were to set up a markup, could be the sales account, some type of sales account that you would have, or you might have another account basically for the markup. So I'm going to keep that here. So you want these two checked. I want to track the reimbursed expenses as income, and I want to mark all expenses as billable here. Make sure those two are checked. We're going to go ahead and say OK, and that will be it.